interview with Ian Lustick, a political scientist known for applying comparative politics and historical analysis to some of the hardest and complicated questions regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He earned his PhD at UC Berkeley in political science, served as a State Department analyst working on Israel, the West Bank, and settlement policy, but above all, he is the author of Paradigm Lost, which basically argues that the two-state framework has already collapsed into a one-state reality. You can read more about Ian Lustick in our interview with him on our blog, 6degrees.blog, but you can also see it on our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you so much and enjoy the interview.
You were born in 1949 in Syracuse, New York, and your family later moved to the small town of Watertown. You've mentioned that life there felt like a shtetl, and that you even encountered instances of anti-Semitic harassment as a boy. How did those early experiences in your family's patriotic immigrant background shape your identity and inspire your interest in politics and history?
Well, that's a big question. When I say that Watertown felt like a shtetl, what I mean is that there were only maybe 100 Jewish families in north of Syracuse, in northern New York, in that part of that side of the Adirondacks. So you lived in a world where all the Jews knew each other very well, spent almost all their time with one another, and all the non-Jews knew who the Jews were, and that was obviously part of what they saw when they looked at you. There were very few. I never had a Jewish teacher in Watertown, and always wondered what it would be like. I wasn't mistreated. Yes, I confronted anti-Semitism. I think that kids tease other kids with anti-Semitic insults and so on everywhere. It's not, you don't have to live in something like a shtetl where I did, but it did produce a feeling of warmth toward Jewish community. But because my family lost so many people in the Holocaust, murdered by the Nazis in Poland and in Lithuania, I grew up with that as a bedrock idea that is what you learn from. You do not allow that to happen again to anybody, never again for anyone. And that Jews, I thought at the time that the thing that was special, one thing that was special about Jews, and why I was happy to be a part of that group, was that it was a particular group with a universalist message, which is kind of contradictory, but I sort of thought that that's the kind of Jewishness I believed in. It's not something that was, I think I was in a more traditional Jewish community, people who had come to the United States from Europe and were glad to be making a living, were focused much more on their daily lives, not on world politics. But my family was a little different, and I got caught up, as you know, in the anti-war movement, in which some of the ideas and ideals that I had developed in Hebrew school and as a Jew, I felt I was applying.
And building on that, when you arrived at Brandeis in 1967, it was right in the middle of the anti-war movement and student activism. What was it like coming of age in that turbulent era, and how did it shape your decision to study politics?
Well, I went to Brandeis because I wanted to find out what Jews actually were like. I think I was in such an unusual little place, almost like an Anatevka place, which what would it be like to have a Jewish teacher? I had no idea. So I went to Brandeis, which was is a Jewish university, and there I found, okay, these are Jews. There are all kinds of Jews, and I got into arguments with people about everything, which was fine. But one of the things that I came in contact with right away was the anti-war movement, which in Watertown was not something you felt very much, though I was already a big fan of Phil Oakes and had taken on a certain anti-war stance. But in 1967, I became very involved in the anti-war movement. And then in 1969, I went to Israel for 6 months, and that really changed my life because I had very deep commitments to Israel and to Zionism of a liberal Zionist sort. And when I got there, I found that not all supporters of Israel had those values, that there was a right-wing chauvinist version of Zionism that was very strong. And I found, because I went to Palestinian refugee camps, I talked to Palestinians, I found that there was this Palestinian issue that was very, very deep and very, very difficult. And I basically came out of that situation writing a student paper in while I was in Jerusalem in 1969 on what the West Bank and Gaza Arabs really wanted. And that was in 69. And what I said, based on my interviews and my research, was that they ultimately wanted a separate Palestinian state alongside of Israel, which at that time was not what was publicly being said by the PLO. But I predicted that the PLO would adopt that position and urged Israel to open itself up to that idea, which at that time was a taboo topic to even discuss. So when I went to graduate school to become a political scientist, I always knew that the one of the key problems I'd always look at would be the Arab-Israeli question. And that experience, publishing that, I published that paper. That was my first publication. And it gave me the confidence, not only that political science, well applied, could actually help you understand the present and forecast the future, but that I personally was able to do that. And that's been a key element in my career ever since, is that I believe by looking straight at the reality, trying to put your emotions aside in terms of what you would like to see, but seeing just what is there and thinking systematically about it, you can actually see what is most likely to happen, what can happen, and what the forces that are that will be determining what will happen. And that's been, I think that's my success in that has been part of why I've had the career I've had.
Mhm. And not long after, you briefly stepped into government as a State Department analyst after the Camp David Accords. How did that experience inside U.S. policymaking shape the way you approached your scholarship when you returned to academia?
Well, it wasn't quite shortly thereafter, although maybe after all this time it looks shortly thereafter. But I graduated from Berkeley with a PhD in political science. I'd spent my years in Israel doing research on my dissertation, which was on Arabs inside of the country, Arab citizens of the country, not Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza. When I graduated from Berkeley, I got a job at Dartmouth, and I was an assistant professor there at Dartmouth College. And while I was there, I had the opportunity, as you said, to move to the government for a year as a Council on Foreign Relations Fellow. And that was a singularly important and interesting experience. I was an analyst with very high clearances in the State Department, in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and my responsibility was to analyze relations between Israel and the West Bank, and in particular settlements, because at that time, in the Carter administration, negotiations were going on to try to implement some kind of autonomy negotiation, some kind of transitional arrangement for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza that weren't, those arrangements weren't specified in the Camp David Accords, only that there would be negotiations toward them. And many people, including myself, were very skeptical about whether they could ever work. But that was my job, and I was an advisor to the autonomy negotiations, and I found a lot out so much about the way government works and about the qualities of the people who work in government. I developed tremendous respect for the professionalism and intelligence of analysts, foreign service officers, CIA analysts, operatives throughout the government who took foreign relations of the United States very seriously, did not allow their own political affiliations to determine how they acted and how hard they worked and what sacrifices they made. That what I also accomplished there was the following. I was unusual because what they were asking me to do, I knew more about than almost anyone in the world, except for maybe a few people in Israel. That was what were the exact techniques the Israelis were using to expropriate land, settle people there, protect it legally, come up with all kinds of ways to transfer land or water without officially taking it. Very, very complicated things. Because of that, I was deeply involved in very controversial discussions inside the government. So I saw the way the government works inevitably when there are disagreements within it over what to do. But I also saw how knowledge, I wasn't afraid to say what I thought was true because I wasn't worried about losing my job. I was only there for a year. I didn't have my career wasn't dependent on what my superiors thought of what I said. So I was like, hey, somebody very unusual because most people, when they speak in a corporate or a government context, have to calculate, well, I might think that, but I better not say it that way because I'll get in trouble or I'll lose the respect of my superior. I need a recommendation. I don't want them to demote me, and so on and so forth. That I also, while I was there, learned how to speak government. That is, how you can talk to people in the government as an academic with expertise that they don't have, how you can communicate that expertise in a way that they can hear it and not in a way that it gets dismissed as airy fairy ivory tower precision that has no worldly meaning. Because of that, I was actually offered a position permanently, and I decided no, I wanted to go back to academia because something else I discovered was when you're out of academia, out of government, you tend to feel if I were in government, I could have an influence. And of course, you can. But when you're in government, you also feel, my God, I can't say publicly what I think. Everything I say is filtered through my superiors. If only I was outside the government, then I could say what I think and have some influence. So ultimately, I felt that the way I am, the kind of skills I have, what I like to do, I was much better as a scholar outside. But I ended up doing a lot of consulting after I left the State Department because of the connections I made, because of the way I learned to be able to speak to intelligence people, bureaucrats, Pentagon people, and because of the deep knowledge that I had about issues that they cared about, which it turned out was not just about Arab-Israeli affairs, but other things as well. So that experience had a tremendous effect on me and on my life.
And in addition to the Middle East, you've done comparative analysis of other conflicts. For example, looking at British rule in Ireland or French rule in Algeria alongside Israel's situation. What insights did you gain from comparing those cases? Did examining how colonial powers dealt with insurgencies or left their territories, like Britain in Northern Ireland or France in Algeria, shed light on why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been so intractable?
Yes, the short answer is yes, but there is a very long answer. I ended up, when you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, everyone who starts to look at it thinks well, this is unbelievably intricate and unique. I mean, it's so peculiar, it's so unusual. There's nothing like it in the world. Now, actually, if you look at any conflict, Kashmir or Cyprus, you'll feel the same way. But the key thing is to be able to see what is general in a conflict, what is not, to use political science categories and see not necessarily that you could get 100 conflicts to compare with it, but get a couple that have certain key characteristics. And when you look at them historically, you can compare the trajectories to see what similarities and differences match with what outcomes. So when I looked at the Israeli problem in the West Bank and Gaza, which is what I was mainly interested in, because I felt that if only I felt for many years that if only Israel could get out of the West Bank and Gaza, there could be a two-state solution, a Palestinian state and an Israel, a Jewish state, and they could not everyone's rights would be satisfied, but they could live together with a minimal sense of satisfaction. As you know, I no longer think that's possible, but for a long time, I wanted to do as much as I could to see how it could be possible. So I had to find parliamentary democracies like Israel that had ended up trying to incorporate territories that they couldn't digest. And I found a few cases. The Germans tried to do that in Poland, in East Prussia, but when they got defeated in World War One and all those territories got taken away from them, the political problem of how Germany could get rid of its Polish territories evaporated because they lost a war. Israel wasn't losing a war to just take the West Bank and Gaza away from it. It had a political problem internally. How could people decide to give up something in the short run that they were worried would cause them problems in the long run? So I found the British and French cases. The British ended up, after hundreds of years of contact with Ireland, ruling a country filled with Irish Catholics that they could not digest. And the French had the same problem in Algeria. Now, I actually wrote three books in order to understand the triple comparison of Britain and Ireland, France and Algeria, Israel and the West Bank, Gaza. The key I found to understanding them was the settlers. Though that's the key thing I found, that England expanded to include Scotland and Wales, but they couldn't include Ireland successfully. I'm not talking about Northern Ireland, I'm talking about the whole country of Ireland, which was annexed to the United Kingdom in 1800. Why couldn't it absorb that permanently like they did Wales? And the reason is because they had settled Ireland with Protestant settlers who demanded, who had political clout in London and used that political clout to insist that Irish Catholic elites not get any power and not be able to keep their land. The way states expand and integrate new territories is that they let the local elites become national elites and keep their land. But when you settle a territory, the settlers stand in the way of that. That happened in the United States, in the South. And when when the federal government tried to make treaties with the Indians, the state legislatures representing the frontiersmen negated those treaties and essentially started wars with the Indians that resulted in their eradication. Well, in Algeria, the same thing happened. The settlers that France put in Algeria in the 19th century got so much power in Paris that they would not allow reforms to be extended to the Muslims so that Muslims could be proud Frenchmen owning land in Algeria, as the Welsh leadership or the Scottish lowland leadership ended up in Scotland. So I was interested, what would the settlers' effect be on Israel? And that ended up, as I said, on three books. One just on Britain and Ireland, Britain and France historically, one on Jewish settlers in the West Bank and Gaza, and one on all three together, a very long book by Cornell Press in 1993 called Unsettled States, Disputed Lands. So the bottom line is, once a state settles a territory like that, it puts itself into a horrible position, which it can only escape from through risking civil war within itself. The British did that, or the French did that. De Gaulle crushed the Civil War attempt to overthrow him and got out of all Algeria. Britain had the opportunity to get out of all of Ireland, but Prime Minister Asquith stepped back from the threatened civil war, and instead Britain ended up with the Northern Ireland problem for hundreds of years later. Israel has not produced a de Gaulle capable of facing down the settlers, and instead the settlers and their allies have essentially taken over the country. And that's why the country is now effectively won, including the West Bank and Gaza. So that's a long answer to your question, but I spent all that time studying that, inspired by the question that I faced in the State Department, which was, what should the United States do if Israel does annex the territories? If they settle so much that they can't withdraw, what can American policy be? Because our policy is for partition. At that time, it wasn't officially for two states, but it was moving that way. Well, since it was so horrible for American presidents to think of what they could come up with, they just said, no, never say that annexation has occurred. Just always say that there's still a possibility, that the point of no return hasn't been passed. So all of my work until the Paradigm Lost book was on understanding the dangers of using such a simple way of looking at something, that there's a point of no return, but we will never approach it. And that's what I've been studying.
And in the late 1980s, you turned your attention to the rise of Jewish religious fundamentalism in Israel. In your book, For the Land and the Lord, you suggested that if it weren't for Israel's external conflicts with its neighbors, the country might have already faced an internal civil war between secular and religious Zionists. What led you to that striking theory, and how was it received at the time? Looking at Israel today, with deep internal divisions, do you feel that prediction bears relevance?
Well, frankly, I don't recall saying exactly that. Although what you said, that Israel is saved from internal civil war by its external threats, is a commonplace of analysis of Israel. It's not something that I've put my flag on. But I did say, as I just explained, and I did argue in that book, that although their ideas were completely weird to most Israelis, and certainly to American liberals and most Americans, the idea that Jews were not a normal people. Jews were actually God's chosen people, completely different from all others, that there would inevitably be lots of wars in order for on the way for Israel to establish Jewish control of all of the land that God had promised the Jews in the Bible, and that only when it was conquered and settled would the Messiah come. And would redemption come to the whole world? And since the world was fundamentally recalcitrant and antagonistic to Jews, this truth, this God's truth, would be resisted horribly by the world. Israel should not listen to the world. It should do everything it could in order to fulfill this apocalyptic destiny. Now, I was fascinated that people who were intelligent could think this weird way. So I wrote a book in order to get inside their minds to see that from their point of view, once you accept certain axioms, all the things that we think are normal look crazy, and all the things that we think are crazy to them look normal. So that's what that book was about. And it was also a, a prediction, a forecast that this group, however weird it looked, could take over the country and destroy the future of both Palestinians and Israelis. I talked about the threat to the Temple Mount, which is now even greater than it ever has been, the racism in the threats of mass expulsion, the threats of quickly getting rid of the possibility of Israel leaving the West Bank and Gaza. I have also talked so anyway, that's what that book was about. It was a And what I have been horrified to see is that the possibilities that I was raising have come true. That the regime in Israel has produced governments so extreme that they essentially are carrying out the policies of these fundamentalist, ultranationalist people who were a small minority in the 1980s and now dominate the government in Israel and are responsible for this horrible war which has been going on for so long.
And over the last decade, you've argued that the classic two-state solution to Israeli-Palestinian conflict is essentially paradigm lost. In fact, your 2019 book, Paradigm Lost: From Two-State Solutions to One-State Reality, analyzes how the two-state approach has faded away. What are the core reasons you believe the two-state solution has disappeared? And when you talk about a one-state reality that needs democratizing, what does that look like in practice? Are you essentially advocating a binational state with equal rights for all? And how do you respond to skeptics of that idea?
Well, those are three or four different questions. So let's go through them one by one. The first one is, so what caused the disappearance of the two-state solution? And when I say disappearance, I mean nobody. No, you can't find anyone who can describe how they think that could be achieved. They can say, we hope, we want to pretend, or we want to treat it as if it could, but no one will tell you how they think it could be achieved. And that's been true for a decade and a half. How come? In my book, I identify three basic reasons. All of them have to do with why Israel changed. It's not just the settlements. The settlements, 750,000 Jews, one out of every 10 practically Israeli Jews are living in the West Bank. Why? But why is that? Why has all of that been able to happen? Billions of dollars invested because Israel changed, and it changed in an extreme way. If we think in American terms, it used to be something like, Connecticut, a blue state, a New Jersey. Then it was in the 1980s, back and forth between Likud and Labor, it was a purple state. It was like Ohio or Pennsylvania. It's now Idaho. Okay, it's Oklahoma. It's extremely red. So how did it get that way? Three different things I point to. One is a little complicated. It is that Zionism, when it first came to Palestine, quickly figured out that it didn't have anything to offer the Arabs that the Arabs would ever accept, because they knew that if they were the Arabs, they would never accept that one's land was being taken away. So, and yet the Zionists didn't believe that in the end there needed to be peace, that in a long, long run, there couldn't be a Jewish state permanently at war with the Middle East. So, what was the solution to that problem? It was called the Iron Wall. It was a term that was invented by a right-wing Zionist called Jabotinsky, but it was adopted essentially by Ben Gurion and the rest of the Zionist movement. What was the idea of the Iron Wall? We build an army so strong that even though the Arabs will attack us repeatedly, they will be defeated repeatedly. And we will defeat them very harshly, not in a cruel way, but in a way that shows them that we can't be destroyed. Eventually, after many, many defeats, the Palestinians and the Arabs as a whole will split between moderates and extremists. That there will be some who will never give up the idea that it's their land and only their land, but there will be moderates who will think, enough already, a half a loaf is better than none. And then we will negotiate with them. We will reach a compromise with them based on equal national rights. Now, that was the theory, but what happened was that they were successful in eventually, after 48 and 56 and 67, the Palestinians and the Arab world started to split. And some Palestinians, and Egypt and Jordan, started to say, yeah, let's make a peace with Israel based on territorial compromise, even though it's not fully just. But the response in Israel was not, okay, we finally won. It was, oh, why should we give them what they can't take from us militarily? They've been killing all our people all these years, and we have a right to everything. So just as it was natural, thought the Zionists, for Arabs to become more accommodating if they lose, and that's what happened, it was also natural for Israel, victorious over and over and over again, to expand what its demands were. It's not natural for a country to be victorious over enemies it considers evil and then retreat to earlier minimalist positions. So that was what I call a flaw in the theory of the Iron Wall. That made the second was the way the Holocaust came to be remembered, and that was done in the late 70s by Menachem Begin and others who said, "Look, if you're a Jew, the only thing you have to know is the Holocaust, and the fact that Gentiles are always ready to do another one on you. Anything, especially that seems like it might be connected to opposition to us, is liable to be Nazi inspired, and there's nothing we shouldn't do to stop it." That, what I call holocaustia, this triggering of hyperlinks from anything that happens to a fear of another Holocaust, made it very difficult for politicians to convince Israelis that they should trust any Gentiles, let alone the Palestinian Arabs, when it came to negotiations. The third and probably most interesting cause of Israel's lurch to the right is the power of the Israel lobby in the United States. It developed an absolute hammerlock on American policy toward Israel. No president, no matter, and most of them wanted to get a deal between Israel and the Arabs or Israel and the Palestinians, but were stymied over and over again by the fact that the domestic political costs of trying to get that deal by making Israel compromise on some of its demands were too great. So whether it was Carter or Clinton or Obama or Reagan or Nixon or Ford, they all got defeated by the lobby because domestic politics was always more important. Now, the lobby organized itself in order to protect Israel from undue pressure. But what it never actually wanted a right-wing extreme government in Israel. But the fact that the United States constantly gave Israel all that it wanted without any pressure made it impossible for moderate politicians in Israel who were trying to say that compromise is necessary, that we have to give things to get what we really want. Those politicians were all defeated because the right-wing politicians could say the United States will never pressure us. We can have everything we want. We can get all this American aid and keep the territories and settle them. And they were right over and over again. So the politicians such as Yossi Sarid or Yossi Beilin or Shulamit Aloni or Chaim Ramon, who would have made wonderful moderate leaders, were driven from politics, were defeated, never became prime minister. Now, then you ask another question. So now we have the one state reality, as I call it. That is a reality. There's a difference between, it's not a solution. One of the things that I try to explain to people, I find unusually difficult, is I can think about the future of the Israel-Palestine and have many pretty pictures of that. I could imagine two states, or a federation of the whole Middle East, or maybe 23 cantons throughout, and I have maps of all these. There are about 20 of them. Very pretty pictures. None of them are a solution. Why? Because a solution is a pretty picture of the future with a way to get there. Now, people say, well, a one-state solution is impossible. I don't know how to get there. And they're right. I don't know the political policy levers to pull and push to get to a one-state solution. That is a pretty picture of one democratic state that everybody's happy with. But I also don't know how to get to two states anymore. So that means I don't have a solution, but I do have an outcome. And the outcome is that there's a single non-democratic state now that includes a 5.5 million or 5 million Palestinians with no citizenship rights whatsoever, and more Arabs between the river and the sea than there are Jews, because there are a lot of non-Jewish non-Arabs. So that's an outcome. So then, and it's not pretty, but it won't be stable forever, although there are ways that part of the way the two-state solution argument is being used is to keep it frozen in this kind of a unrecognized apartheid for as long as possible. And one way you do that is to say, I don't know how to get a two-state solution, but we have to maintain hope that it someday will come. And in the meantime, there's no rights for Palestinians. And that allows Israel not to face the democratic challenge that exists because half its population essentially is disenfranchised. So that's why the continuing hold on the two-state solution is so actually destructive when it used to be a positive thing. Now you asked a final question is, so how do I imagine in practice this one-state reality? As I just said, in practice, it's a non-democratic, non-recognized apartheid situation. But it's more complicated than that because some Arabs who live inside the Green Line have some rights and so on. But in Gaza, it's much worse than apartheid. It's a free fire zone, essentially, under Israeli control. So from a practical point of view, if I don't have a solution in mind, if I don't have a vision that I know how to get to, what is my moral responsibility and my political responsibility? And here's what I say. When you look at a situation, in a question, think what your values are and then say what you think should be done. If you believe in equality, if you believe in democracy, if you believe in non-exclusivist rights to national self-determination, apply those values. Don't say, whoops, I better not give votes to Arabs in East Jerusalem because that will recognize the occupation and make a two-state solution less possible. No, there is no two-state solution. Just say it's better if people have rights to vote and favor that. That's what I mean by just looking at the situation and saying, I don't know whether this is good or bad for the ultimate outcome. I just know that it's better than it's good. I want people to have rights. I want people to have security. I want people to have democracy or equality as much as possible. And I want people to be able to respect one another's identities in a non-exclusivist way. When people operate like that, which is all we can do now because we don't have a vision that we know how to get to, over time, and here's where the fundamental optimism of being Jewish and being a scholar comes into being. Over time, I believe that the unintended consequences of people trying to do the right thing will ultimately lead to people in Israel and Palestine putting some of their wilder aspirations in their pockets so that they can get what they absolutely need from one another. For example, if in order to work together in an alliance, moderate Palestinians and moderate Jews, each of them is going to have to do something. The Jews are going to have to forget their Zionism or put it in their pocket. We're not going to talk about ourselves as Zionists. We're citizens of this country, okay? And we are going to affiliate with other citizens who have needs just like we do. And the Palestinians are going to put the Nakba in their pocket, not because they don't remember it, but because it's not going to be the basis of the alliance that they need to solve their current problems. When I start, and organizations like that are forming in Israel and Palestine now, of course, overshadowed completely now by the horrors in Gaza and in the West Bank, but those are the seeds of hope for the future.
And you've written that Israel should negotiate with groups like Hamas as a part of facing the one-state reality. That's a perspective many find controversial. Why do you think engaging with Islamist movements such as Hamas is necessary for future resolution? Based on your research, what misunderstandings do Western policymakers or the Israeli public have about groups like Hamas that need to be addressed in order to move forward?
Well, I think the basis of your question is that there's this conception of Hamas uh, as like ISIS, or it's just a set of fanatics that are bloodthirsty. And the fact is that the leadership that Hamas ended up with, because almost all its other leadership were assassinated, were like that. But and they certainly were not candidates for any kind of negotiation, except for ending the war. I mean, there is opportunities Hamas has right now. Even this leadership has a proposal on the table that the Israeli cabinet won't even discuss because most Israelis, including all the security services and the military, support it. So it's not like Israel itself doesn't have contact with Hamas. Helped create Hamas in the beginning because they thought it was safer than the PLO. So the idea that what's mainly the problem with Western ideas is that they don't have the facts in front of them. They think Hamas conquered Gaza. No, what happened is that the United States under George Bush insisted that there be free elections in Gaza. To his credit. And the result was that Hamas won the free election. After that, Israel and the United States tried to violently overthrow the Hamas government that was elected using Fatah in Gaza. Hamas figured it out and crushed this coup and expelled all of the Fatah people. That's why Hamas controls Gaza. Now, that's not exactly known by most people, but if you do know that, you can say, yes, of course you have to engage them. You have to engage Israelis and Palestinians. You have to engage one another, all of one another. You can't just say Ben Gvir and Smotrich are terrorists. We are not going to engage with them. They're the Israeli government. You know, you talked about, let's remember Yitzhak Shamir, who was a prime minister of Israel. Before 1948, he was the leader of the squad, the organizer, the director of the squad that assassinated Count von Bernadotte in Jerusalem, the UN mediator. Begin himself proudly described himself and his organization as a terrorist. So the idea that, oh my goodness, there are groups that use violence, we can't ever treat them as legitimate interlocutors is absurd. Not only is your terrorist my freedom fighter, but today's terrorist is tomorrow's prime minister. That's just the way the world has worked. Now, finally, I want to say that I'm not pushing negotiations as the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. I do think that the negotiations about ending this Gaza war, that's obviously important, and they should have been resolved long ago. And I made a prediction at the beginning of the war that it would never end, the war would not end until the United States forced Israel to end it, because the political cost to an Israeli government of ending it would be too high. I made that prediction almost 2 years ago, and it is unfortunately being validated every day. But The reason I'm saying that is I don't believe that negotiations will then be put in place to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Israel rules all of Palestine. What we need is integration and emancipation of all the people who live in that country to be able to have rights to participate in the government that rules them. And if you're looking, this may be a little bit of a shock or interesting, but if you're looking for places where Palestinians in Gaza should be moved to, they should be moved into South Western Israel. All around Gaza is virtually uninhabited, and it's where most of those people came from to begin with. So you don't have to look too far. And not only that, but those they would want to move there. You don't have to pay them to move there. Uh, Interestingly, also, the original Trump-Kushner plan that was accepted by the Netanyahu government at one point imagined hundreds of thousands of Gaza Arabs being moved into the northern Negev, into Israel, into new residential areas. The map of the Trump-Kushner plan shows that. So what I'm suggesting is actually something that President Trump himself uh, proposed, even though no one has talked very much about it.
And in a 1989 review, Rabbi Elmer Berger, himself known for anti-Zionist views, paradoxically praised you as a first-class Zionist academic with meticulous scholarship. Over the years, you've had detractors on different sides. Some have labeled you too critical of Israel or even anti-Israel, while others find you too sympathetic to Zionism. How do you navigate these polarized perceptions of your work? Has your own sense of identity as an American, a Jew, and a scholar ever been at odds with your research conclusions? And if so, how do you reconcile that?
Good question. The answer to the last part is no. I made a reference to the optimism that's part of being Jewish and part of being a scholar and or a scientist. Why do I say that? Because if you're committed to producing knowledge about the world so that people understand the world better than they would without your contribution, you are fundamentally implying that more good things will be done with that knowledge than bad things. Because the more knowledge there is, the more evil can be done efficiently. But if there's more good in the world than evil, then you should basically try to manufacture more knowledge. That means that I can't put limits on what I say. I can't say, "Whoops, that's not good for my position. I shouldn't do research on that." No, I should do research on what I'm fascinated by, what I think people are most confused about, and try to explain it to them. And uh, the other reason why I think I have never had a problem with my identity in conflict with my research is because of the prophets. You know, the prophets in the Hebrew Bible are all about telling the government and telling the people truths that neither the government or the people want to hear, but they're truths that they need to hear. So, from my point of view, it's an absolutely traditional, perfect Jewish position to be uh, to be treated as if we don't want to hear what you have to say. It's too painful, even though it may be true. Well, that's exactly what we're supposed to do as Jews, from my point of view. So now I can tell an interesting story that may also illuminate why I don't really take the calumnies that have come my way that seriously. In the 1970s, early 1970s, I organized something called Yesh Breira. That was an organization of Jews to sign a petition to say no more settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, and Israel should accept the establishment of a non-belligerent Palestinian state. There were only 1,100 Jews living in the West Bank at that time, and we organized that as students in Berkeley, at University of California, Berkeley. We organized it. We got 450 signatures worldwide of Jewish activists. The Israeli government ignored us. People who later became heads of the Israeli peace movement thought we were, what are you doing? How can you say this? 1,100 settlers are going to stop peace? Later, of course, it was shown how right we were, that this was the canary in the in the coal mine. This was the beginning of the end of Israel being able to be a democratic Jewish state. Now, I was called a Nazi by other Jews for standing up and calling for a two-state solution in the early 1970s. When I stopped calling for a two-state solution because I thought it was no longer possible and the slogan was being used to enforce apartheid, now I'm being called a Nazi also because I'm opposed to this, supposedly opposed to the two-state solution. Now, that jives with, there's a kind of bitter irony, a kind of delicious irony about this. Uh, I'm usually about 15 years ahead of conventional liberal opinion when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And that's been true my whole career, and I think it will continue to be true. But that's my job, and I don't take it as a problem. In fact, one of the reasons I can do my work is because I'm Jewish with a strong Jewish upbringing. I feel the things that Jews feel. I understand them, and I can speak Jewish language to Jewish audiences. I think that's one reason I've survived, frankly. It also makes me feel when I see my Palestinian and non-Jewish colleagues assaulted for speaking what they consider the truth and what I would think is the truth critically about Israel. They don't have the protection, however thin that may be sometimes, of being Jewish. That is, the fact that I'm Jewish makes it me a stronger responsibility, a heavier responsibility to speak out because I'm more able to do so than non-Jews are.
And today, Israel is going through profound internal debates. For example, over judicial reforms, and we see mass protests and a divide between secular liberal segments and religious nationalist segments of society. As someone who foresaw the potential for internal conflict in Israel's future, how do you interpret the current turmoil? Do you think Israel is at risk of the kind of internal rupture you once hypothesized? And what factors might determine whether it heals or breaks apart along these societal faults?
Well, the answer to that question is complicated. I wrote an article about it that appeared in Israel Studies Review. Israel on the cusp of regime change. And so let me just say a little bit about what the article says. When you see the masses of people in the streets, whether they're trying to end the war in Gaza or they're trying to stop the judicial coup, uh, you see that almost all of those demonstrators are Jews. Palestinian Arabs that make up 21% of the citizenry of the country are not participating, not because they don't agree, but because they're repressed and because they're scared, and because, for the most part, the Jewish demonstrators don't want them because they're afraid that the other side of the political spectrum will say, "See your Arab lovers. We're not. You've got Arabs there in your demonstration," which is to say that the country is still organized as a Jewish Zionist regime, not as a liberal democracy where whoever you are, you have a right to participate. What's really at stake in the judicial reform is not what the government says is at stake. What's really at stake is this. They know that they want to annex the West Bank and Gaza. That means 5 million more Arabs in the country. That means in order to maintain the country, you have to put into law, deeply into law, that there can be no anything but a Jewish state. You want to be able to have laws that prevent votes from being given to West Bank and Gaza Arabs. The Jews who are in the streets can't say, "We are fighting for the future rights of Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza to become citizens." They can't say that because it would make them look like Arab lovers and people who were for a one-state solution under Palestinian domination. But the right knows that the reason it needs to control the judiciary and turn Israel into past the nation state law, delegitimize Arab political participation entirely, is because it is building an Arab majority into the state, and it won't be able to win elections in the future. So these dislocations are both a sign of what's of of the depth of the crisis, but also because Arabs are not involved, a sign of what you have to look for when you know things are going to really change. When Arabs and Jews are demonstrating together, and they include West Bank and Gaza Arabs at the same time. And we're not close to that, but that's what you have to really watch for.
And in the United States and Europe, we've been witnessing a worrying rise in anti-Semitism in recent years. For instance, Nick Fuentes, the leader of the so-called Groyper movement, has brought openly anti-Jewish and white nationalist rhetoric into mainstream politics. As someone who has studied ethnic conflict and lived through earlier eras of anti-Semitism, what's your perspective on this resurgence? Do you see parallels between today's far-right movements and historical precursors? And what do you think society and leaders should be doing in response to this growth of hate?
Well, I mean, I haven't studied specifically the rise of the right-wing Fuentes current temporary anti-Semitism. I'm much more focused on the lately on the general rise in anti-Semitism, but the even larger rise in false accusations of anti-Semitism. Uh, but just a quick answer to your specific question is yes, there are parallels to past uses of anti-Semitism by right-wing groups. Anything, any group, especially populist groups, which specialize in conspiracy theories to advance their agenda uh, and treat the elites of society, especially professional and knowledge-based elites, as the enemy, Jews are going to be the target. They always were and they always will be. So Jews are definitely vulnerable when authoritarian populism comes to the fore. They will be the target. But I want our listeners to understand that two things about the rise in anti-Semitism. One is that it is true and it is due mainly to actions by the Israeli state taken as a representative of the Jewish people. You remember a terrible thing happened during World War II when Franklin Roosevelt ordered the internment of hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans. Why? They didn't do anything, but the Japanese state was making war on the United States. So those citizens were identified as, well, the state of Japan is doing this, so they are implicated. It's terrible, but it's a natural thing. When Israel is doing such horrible things, people who already have anti-Semitic feelings are going to let them loose. And those that constantly see Jews doing terrible things to non-Jews are going to start to develop those ideas. So that's one horrible result of the war is a rise in anti-Semitism. The other thing, though, is something that social scientists understand that most people don't completely understand. How could I, let me ask you this, I ask my students this, how could I increase the amount of crime in a society, double it or triple it, without changing anyone's behavior?
I'm not entirely sure.
Just pass laws which criminalize the behavior that people are doing naturally. If I pass more laws that make something a crime, then I'm going to double or triple the amount of crime in the society. So if you change the definition of anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel at a time when Israel is doing all kinds of things worthy of criticism, of course the statistics are going to show huge skyrocketing rates of anti-Semitism. I mean, but very few people understand how that works. So the problem of increasing anti-Semitism has many dimensions, and we can only touch on a couple of them right now.
Beyond anti-Semitism, nationalism seems resurgent worldwide. First, from American firstism to the rise of right-wing populism in Europe to ethno-religious nationalism in countries like India or Turkey. Given your expertise in how states handle diversity and conflict, how do you think people and governments should go about handling these issues? What lessons can we draw from history about where surges of ultranationalism can lead if unchecked?
Well, there certainly is a worrisome trend from a liberal world order toward one dominated by authoritarian populism with appeals to ethnocentrism. We see it in China with the terrible genocidal regime of subordination and domination exercised over the Uyghurs. We see it even in Russia and Ukraine, where differences between Russians and Ukrainians are not very large, but from an ethno, they can exploit, they can exaggerate those. We saw it in Yugoslavia. We so one of the things to fight back against this is that you have to strengthen a liberal world order, a world order that is based on countries on free interchange. Now, that's not this necessarily full out neoliberalism, but it does mean that countries don't play zero sum games with one another. They play positive sum games. They look at the climate problem. And it means this, and this is what is harder to understand. For the countries that are biggest and richest and that benefit the most from a stable world order, they actually have to contribute more than their share than the other people. They have to allow themselves, as it were, to be a little bit exploited in order for the whole system to work to their advantage. This is a common, almost a law of social science that in a collective action problem requires the strong to be exploited by the weak, and when Trump says the United States has to be first. We're going to penalize everybody by with tariffs and so on. He's forgetting that we benefit more than anyone by a world system that was subsidized in part by us allowing people to have a few advantages over us. So that whole mindset is something we have to encourage. But as you suggest, it doesn't look the future doesn't look bright in that regard. And I certainly don't have any magic solutions. Uh, I, I wrote a book. My first book on Arabs in Israel was to note that Arabs were being controlled by the Israeli state, but they weren't being eradicated. And that control was actually better than eradication, not as good as democracy. Well, throughout the world, it's important for us to identify where genocide is actually on the table, which is actually happening, and for the world to treat those countries as pariah states. Even if they have, they can control a population, they can do all kinds of things that are not democratic, but we have to draw a line internationally at genocide and or things that are genocidal levels of violence and murder. And that's something that I think is doable. I think we're seeing it across the world with respect to what Israel is doing in Gaza, and it is having an effect. It is limiting Israel in some ways.
Looking ahead, where do you see the Israeli-Palestinian situation in the next 10 to 20 years? Are you hopeful that there could be a breakthrough or positive change, or do you think the one-state reality will simply deepen? What indicators or events would signal to you that a genuine resolution of whatever form is becoming more possible?
So I did mention that when I see Jews and Arabs in the same alliances, and not talking about the Nakba and not talking about Zionism, then I'll know that real progress has been made. But I'm going to ask you a question, uh, and, and to see as part of my answer to your question. Imagine you're in the 1880s in the United States. Okay, Reconstruction has ended. Jim Crow is dominating the South. Blacks in the United States are considered technically free, but they don't have any real rights to vote, no political power. How now you're in the 1880s. I say to you, tell me, when do you think in the next 10 to 20 years there's any chance that there'll be a black president?
I would
Oh,
say
yeah.
no.
You would say no.
Mhm.
Well, I ask you, what would you look for as a good sign for change?
I mean,
You,
nothing
you
that
see
can.
how
Hmm?
you see how difficult that
Yeah,
problem
of
is?
course. I mean,
Okay, so what that teaches you by seeing that is that the kind of problem that Israel is facing with the Palestinians is not a problem which exists in sports time or strategic time. It's not something that can be solved in months or years. It's in geologic time politically. It's generations. So when you overthrow a dictatorship and set up a democracy, like in Romania, you kill the dictator, now you have a democracy. Overnight, in 1989, all these countries became democracies. That's easy form of democratization. When you have a country that has excluded huge groups of its population because they are deemed unfit for politics, whether because blacks, because they're women, because they're Jews, they're Catholics, whether it's in Britain or wherever it is. If you do that, how long does it take to change your society, to democratize, to bring the women into politics, to bring the blacks, the despised populations in, to bring the Jews, to bring the Catholics? How long does it take? It takes 100 years. That democratization process requires splits in the dominant forces so that some of them start to see advantages in emancipating the peripheries, the subordinated, despised peripheries. So when people ask me, what do you see in the future when it comes to an actual positive picture, I'm thinking generations. I'm thinking, look at what it looked like in the 1880s or early 1900s in the United States and think, okay, what kind of investments then should we be making? And that's where you go back to if you think something's right, follow your values. Don't think, I'm doing this because I want this to happen and I want that to happen and therefore this will happen. No, just do what's right. You're too far away from a solution to think otherwise.
Okay, and I'll end off on a question that we ask all of our interviewees, which is how do you define success, both personally or with your work?
I define success. Let's talk about my work, but it's very personal for me. Is if in our encounters, whether those are in person or through my writing, where people come to understand the things that really matter to them as they actually are, instead of thinking about things which either don't matter or thinking about them in very distorted ways. Success to me is being able is getting people to say, "Oh, I see. Wow, now I have a new way and a better way and a more effective way of thinking about what to do in this world." That's success for me.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all the
Thank
questions I
you.
have.
You did a good job. Let me know what happens with this interview.
Okay, and thank you so much for joining. I've been personally interested. People are super passionate about the issue. People around me, I have Jewish friends. I'm personally Iranian. know Iranian Jews. I know Palestinian Jews. I know. I did an internship with a Jewish person all summer. There's Jewish people in my club. And people are just so passionate about the issue. There's my sister's friend. I was thinking about this when I was writing the questions. She's a Norwegian. Her dad's a billionaire. She drives an Aston Martin. And she has Palestine tattooed on her wrist in Arabic.
Wow,
People are
wow.
super, it's just,
Well, I want you to think about yeah, I know they are. And if you wanted to talk to me again sometime, if you get caught in any of that, feel free. But I wanted to just raise one thing before I go. You used the phrase Jewish person. When you talked about that woman, you just said she was Norwegian. You didn't say she's a Norwegian person. I want you to note that people will say African American. They don't say African American person. You
hmm
said you're an Iranian. You say I'm an Iranian person.
hmm
So what is it that leads people to say a Jewish person? And I'll tell you what it is. It's a
hmm
lingering fear that the word Jew is a dirty word.
Yeah, exactly.
That's ridiculous.
hmm
When I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs once and they changed the word Jew to Jewish person, I said, no, absolutely not.
hmm
That implies that I think there's something wrong with the word Jew. But see how that sneaks into your natural language in a way
hmm
that's reflective of just how scary it is to negotiate those areas.
That's very, and I saw one of your interviews you were saying making the distinction between grammar and how people normally speak.
Ordinarily, you have done a lot of research for this. I'm very
I
impressed.
thank you. I tried.